Okay, for today, we'll talk about technology selection, and we're gonna take a look at some key ideas or key principles or key themes or concepts that would fall under this general theme of technology selection. Okay. Now, like all the other themes in technology management, you are aware that they can be tackled at greater depth, right? And the purpose of how we're attacking all the themes in technology management is that by looking at the obvious layer, you might think that it's superficial or shallow, but nevertheless, it is hoped that you are still able to get all ideas, or I mean, not all, but maybe some key ideas by looking at the obvious layers in these themes. And then you'd be able to have some material from a practical perspective to apply it in your own personal circumstance. Now, technology selection is typically uh, discussed perhaps at the start of any course in technology management, or it can be discussed towards the end. And the reason why they could be done either at the start or at the end is because it helps situate all the other themes in a more harmonious or integrative perspective. Okay, and this slide will tell you why that is so. Okay, because technology selection is really about strategy. In fact, this theme can be renamed as technology strategy. Okay, the discussions on technology selection or technology strategy would be ideas on how you can position technology for the benefit of your organization. Okay, be it a for-profit company or if it's a social enterprise or even in government. If you think about it, uh, government would also need some technology strategy. Okay, and when we talk about strategy, strategy is nothing more than choice. The reason why you are setting about to do something, okay, is okay, you've made the assessment of the situation, you've taken a look at yourself, you've taken a look at the environment, and now the question is, how do you make do with what you have, with what the environment has, in order for you to achieve your goals? So naturally, strategy is really about a choice on a set of actions that you want to take in order for you to accomplish your goals. Now, generally, the goals can be very specific. In a for profit company, the goal is really just to improve profit, either by increasing your revenue or reducing your costs. Right? Those are the most simplistic perspectives when it comes to for profit. And strategy is taking a choice on how you're going to approach that goal, right? If you want to be profitable, so what's your choice? How do you go about with it? Okay. Now, that said, when we look about technology selection, therefore, it is also about a strategy, and because strategy is about choice, so that's why we can say that strategy is nothing more than how do we say this? Is nothing more than uh, selecting. Okay, and yeah, selection strategy. They're interchangeable. Now we go with the considerations. Okay, so for our commentary today, I mean, the idea is not to zero in on a specific idea or a specific framework about strategy. I'm sure in your own situation, you've had an opportunity to really talk about strategy. And perhaps in your own companies, you would have had a better understanding on what the strategy is being taken by that company. Nevertheless, for our purpose in discussing technology selection or technology strategy, we look at some aspects or key facets that would affect our decision, okay, to take on a particular strategy with regard to technology. Okay. And the first consideration that we'd like to share here is communication. Okay. So once a strategy has been devised, management must clearly communicate it. Okay. And even if it's just like you, if you're in a startup, only a few of you are would be there. Well, communication can be taken for granted, right? Um, and the idea is to make sure that you have the idea of communicating your strategy explicitly, and not only to yourselves but to your stakeholders even. Now, obviously, in a more mature setup, you will be required even, right, sometimes by law, to really disclose what you plan to do for your company. And nevertheless, in when it comes to technology strategy, you would benefit from actually communicating that to your stakeholders. Okay? Senior management must encourage open two-way communication, giving employees that are involved in or affected by the changes the possibility to question the decisions made in order to understand and ultimately turn them into results. Now, this particular phrase or sentence is perhaps the current trend right now when it comes to organizational climate. Um, Even in organizations where we think it is very authoritarian in culture, like the military, for example, nowadays you'd see the military, at least for some military organizations in the world. Okay, not all countries would be like this, but you'd expect the military to be open. Okay, they would even listen to the soldiers who occupy a lower rank in the hierarchy, and of course that doesn't mean that the hierarchy is ignored or left to their own devices, right? But nevertheless, you see even in authoritarian structures nowadays, some openness and willingness to listen. Okay, and that's part of it, and that's what makes strategy more more successful. Okay? It ensures a higher degree of success if you're able to engage people well through good communication. To communicate more effectively, organizations can devise a strategy map. Okay? So the idea of visualization that can come into the picture. So we'd want something a little bit more the visual. But the idea there is to aid people with the idea of trying to understand the strategy better. Okay, and by making it visual, you are hoping that it would ease the execution and the implementation of the strategy very well. Okay, so that's the first consideration when you are devising a strategy, a technology strategy, even for an organization. Well, you have to think of the communication strategy. Okay, what's your communication plan? What's your communication protocol when you decide to do a strategy? And sometimes, uh, when it comes to technology, okay, mind you, the challenge for communication has always been that technology uh, can be very jargon-y, or okay, they're full of jargon sometimes. And for the technologists out there who've been raised in a highly technical environment, they fail to appreciate that sometimes you have to make your jargon understandable, okay, by the lay person or by the average pedestrian, right? In order for you to be able to communicate to the others what the plan would be. as regards your technology, right? And let's give a hypothetical example in this regard, right? You, for example, if your decision was that you will move all of your, um, let's say, accounting system into the cloud, right? And you will forego your on-premise setup already as you move everything to the cloud. Okay, well, you have to explain to people what that's meant, right? What do you mean by the cloud? What's going to be the technical difference between how do we do it before versus now? So things like, okay, I can now access my accounting system even if I'm at home, or just to give an example, right? Or I can do approvals remotely. I don't need to have forms. So basically, while the technical implementation is that I'm moving everything to the cloud, the impact, okay, is something that can be explained in layman's terms. Okay, so and that's part of really understanding your communication plan or communication protocol when you're exploring the strategy, the technology strategy that's appropriate for your organization. Now, the next consideration would be on HR or human resource management. Okay, well, they come in two stages. Okay, the first being involving the right people in the planning stage. Um, And normally, this is the pitfall of a lot of organizations. The planning stage has always been delegated to the team that's responsible for IT because they think, well, it's an IT thing, it's an IT product, it's an IT solution. Therefore, let the IT folks do it. Anyway, we're paying them a lot of money. I don't know if that's still true now. No, paying them a lot of money to actually uh, uh, do the solution for us or to solve that problem for us. Okay. Well, the obviously, as you probably can tell, even from instinct, is that well, that's not going to work. Okay? Nowadays, we know better that if we don't involve the right people, the and among them, let's say, would be key users or important stakeholders, even. Okay, at the planning stage, then whatever strategy we're thinking of, it's probably not going to be as successful as we've hoped for. Okay. Now, specifically, senior management may have a good overall view of the company. Mid-level managers generally have more detailed knowledge about the actual capabilities of their departments. Okay, and not just only at the mid-level, you can probably go even lower, even down to those who are individual contributors. Okay, they would have an understanding on what's on the ground better. But nevertheless, the idea of centralized control when it comes to deciding on the appropriate strategy for the organization, that's no longer true now, as especially as organizations grow to be more and more complex. It's not always the case. So naturally, involving them on in the strategy development stage will ensure that senior management has the necessary information for devising a sound strategy. Okay. Again, and the second stage concerns the guidance and control of the stakeholders involved in implementing the strategy. Okay. So as senior managers must guide, okay, and manage employees' behaviors on a collective basis and support them in developing appropriate skills needed for successful implementation of the strategy. Okay, through training, for example. As such, the HR department holds a pivotal role in turning strategy into action. Now, uh, again, the idea here is that HR is involved, but they're not the sole responsible unit to make sure that the strategy is successful. Okay, in the same way as IT is not solely responsible for that as well. So it's a collective effort. Okay, and where HR can come into the picture is that you can think of HR as a very silent but effective type of concert master, for example. Okay, uh, he or she is not necessarily the conductor. Okay, the one in front, the one who's flashy and really directs the orchestra. Okay, the concert master is really the one who works behind the scenes, make sure that all the the instruments are really in sync, okay, that they really do the work very well in the practices. Okay, so HR can be like that. HR can be really behind the scenes and really play a very strong coordinating role across the organization. Okay? And that's still important in technology strategy, okay, involving HR. Okay? It's and perhaps this might seem to you counterintuitive, right? Wait, that's technology. HR may not know anything about technology. Well, when you're dealing with people, and remember, technology on its own is useless. So therefore, you need people to do it. Well, you still need HR to actually help you, okay, in executing the strategy that's appropriate for your organization. Now, another consideration. This is most one of the more obvious ones, and then more highly discussed aspect is planning. Okay, well, mm, just like any choice, just like any strategy, you have to plan it well. Okay? You have to give yourself a little bit more thinking. Okay? And the idea with strategy is that it's not an academic exercise. Like, okay, I think that the best strategy for our company is do A, B, C. Okay, but at the end of the day, um, the strategy will only earn its salt, so to speak, is that if you're actually able to do A, B, C. Okay, so strategy is not just an intellectual exercise, or is not something that's really academic in nature. It's practical, and therefore you need to plan, and therefore you need to make sure that it can be implemented well. Okay. Uh, okay, but it's possible to implement what is known as a subpar or suboptimal strategy. Um, the results will nonetheless be inferior to those achieved through implementing a carefully crafted strategy. Right now, um, sometimes it's good that you have a strategy. And as long as the planning tasks have been done honestly, have been done to the best of their abilities, even if theoretically the strategy is not the best out there, having a strategy is better than none, right? Naturally, the environment will change rapidly, especially in a VUCA environment, right? I mean, if you've probably heard of VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? In fact, this term came from the military, okay, back at the early 2000s. So, okay, when you're looking in a VUCA environment, okay, things change, okay, and the parameters that you have assumed or factored at the start of your planning stage will no longer be applicable, will no longer be valid, and therefore your strategy will no longer be optimal. Okay, that happens. That's possible. Does that mean that you've made a mistake? Well, no, not necessarily. Okay, and what's more important is the ability to make adjustments. But nevertheless, the lesson that can be derived from this is that if you're really serious about technology strategy, or strategy for that matter in general, you need to have a plan. Any plan would do. It's a good start. Eventually, your organization will build skill, will build maturity into this specific competency on strategic thinking or strategic planning. Eventually, you'll get the hang of it. But you can't do away with planning. Okay? And when you do your planning, one of the things that you will realize is that you will see some problems, some risks along the way. Um, a strategy plan is a poorly planned item if you realize that okay, you haven't been able to think of the risks, you haven't been able to identify the challenges that are possible or that could be brought up. So, nevertheless, part of your planning is you also do risk management. And so that you can address them even before they occur. And the strategy need not be specific, as I said. In a VUCA environment right now, you can't really predict everything. You can't really factor everything down to the T, right? You should allow for certain variations. You should allow for possibilities that if these things happen, then this is what I should be doing. Okay, but even then, it's not too specific, right? You'd probably have like a black box contingency approach there, right? And say that okay, this is what we're going to do, but you're not even too specific about it. Okay, that's fine. That's right. That's right. That's appropriate. You can work with that. Okay, good. Uh, so another consideration when it comes to technology planning is alignment. Okay, top management must ensure. Okay. To dynamically create alignments between the corporate strategy and its strategic actions. Okay. So when we talk about alignment, okay, one particular term that would come into mind here is what we call line of sight. Okay, and when we talk about line of sight, uh, it's the property or the attribute wherein you can connect, let's say, your vision, your mission, your objectives, your goals, your metrics, all the way down. I mean, there's no inconsistency, there's no ambiguity across the board, okay? And that is true not only at the topmost level, but as you cascade it down throughout the organization, there is that harmony. And we call that alignment, okay? Uh, and, and that's important. When you're looking at a particular technology, okay, and you want to implement it or execute it all throughout, you'd want to think, okay, what are we going to do here? Is this technology going to be aligned with values, with the vision of the organization, with the vision of the community? Will this be aligned with everyone's aspirations, perhaps, or needs? Will this actually fit all the needs, immediate needs of the organization? Will this be uh, supportive of the other goals that we have? Okay, so that's alignment. Okay, you want to make sure that you're not just going to be very aggressive, like some sort of a bully, and say, okay, this is my technology, that's it, take it or leave it. Okay, but in an organization that can be very authoritarian, alignment tends to be very poor as well. So you can imagine a very strong, very aggressive IT department who says, okay, no, this time we'll no longer use Google Mail. Okay, everybody goes to Outlook. Okay, I mean, you can be draconian about it, maybe, and perhaps it might work in some organizational contexts. But generally, if you're going to be very rough, if you're very going to be demanding or imposing without proper alignment of what the goals are, maybe um, the chances of success would be slim, right? And even if you're able to execute it as planned, remember that the game is always a long game, right? You may be successful now, but in the future you won't be as successful as you think you'd be, right? So these are difficulties, no? And we talk about alignment. We also talk about, well, as I said earlier, to everybody else. No? When we talk about people, alignment, not just in the abstract concepts of goals, targets, priorities, but you also look at it from the perspective of people. Okay, down from the top management to the middle management to the rank and file. Okay, making sure that all of the concerns, all of the needs are actually properly addressed. Okay, and here's another consideration for technology strategy to be culture. Now, culture is a little bit more amorphous, right? Sometimes culture is like the catch-all phrase for everything that we can seem to describe in the organization. Now, if you say what's wrong with the organization, sometimes it's their culture. I mean, maybe that's true, but sometimes it's not exactly accurate. Okay, yeah, culture is there, it exists, so there's a reality there. But nevertheless, when we talk about culture in relation to technology strategy, well, it's a reality that we have to be aware of. Okay, and what are the aspects of culture that we need to look into? Well, we need to look at the values and the belief system of the organization. Are they the type who would be very conservative, or are they the type to be risk takers? So depending on the value system, for example, you would expect that a conservative organization wouldn't be like gung ho when the new technology comes in, right? So therefore, if you know that the organization is conservative, you'll probably spend more time really trying to get the buy-in of the organization, okay, and explaining to them why or how the new technology or the new implementation would be in continuity with whatever it is that they're doing, right? Right. So that's one way for you. Or if you're in a risk-taking organization, well, the buy-in would still be needed, but it would be different. Like you have to be able to tickle their excitement. Okay, what is it about the new technology that is really new, that's really radical, perhaps? That, what are the expected benefits? Okay, okay, will it make us be the first in certain markets, for instance? So as you see, depending on the value system of the organization, you will have a certain way to approach on getting their buy-ins. Okay. Now, an organization that strives to successfully implement a strategy should encourage, okay, a culture of learning. This is the rave nowadays in management, okay, the learning organization, okay, or things about psychological safety. You probably hear that more often now. Um, well, nevertheless, part of technology strategy is really cultivating a culture of learning as well. I mean, technology has to be learned, right? We've talked about that, okay, in another module concerning learning about technology, okay, and that idea that that openness to really learn about technology. Well, if the culture is not really ready to embrace learning technology, then it will be difficult for you to come up with a good strategy for the organization as regards technology. It's you're gonna fall flat. It's possible that you're gonna fall flat because maybe they'll complain. Maybe they'll say, "No, I'm spending too much time in this and that." Okay, I mean, why do I have to learn? Why can't we just do it the old way? It's not even broken. Right? Well, you can have all these arguments, and some of them may even be true. Okay? But nevertheless, if you really want to make progress organizationally, then you know that making progress requires making change, okay? Technological change, which is another theme uh, that has been discussed. Okay, so there, culture is another consideration for technology strategy. Well, another aspect to consider would be ground rules or norms of the organization. Okay, so there is a set of rules that every organization needs to take into account when aiming to successfully implement their strategy. Okay, so there could be rules, there could be internal policies, there could even be standards that need to be fulfilled or that need to be complied with, okay, whenever you do your technology strategy. And this is true for organizations that are perhaps regulated in a way, like banks, for example. In the financial industry, you would expect certain standards to be fulfilled either way. So you're not always going to be gung ho with the latest and and savviest technology out there. I mean, you'll probably have to match it with what regulation will require. Okay, or in the case, let's say, of medicine, we've encountered this situation in a lot of our projects that, okay, in medicine, well, it's also heavily regulated. You can't just simply implement any solution just like that. Okay, there are certain rules that need to be complied. For example, in filling out prescriptions, okay, so how do you make sure that it's really filled out by the appropriate doctor with a valid license? Okay, or how do you enforce, let's say, privacy, which is now a current a real rule right now, right? How do you enforce data privacy? And how will your technology ensure that that privacy will be safeguarded? Okay, and there are many ground rules. There are many ground rules. No? Like perhaps in the U.S., it's more particular in the U.S. But things about discrimination. How sure are you that technology will not consciously or subconsciously marginalize, let's say, people of color, okay, people of sexual orientation, okay, of certain orientations, okay. How can you ensure that that technology will not alienate them or marginalize them? But there are things like this, okay. Um, if the understanding of these ground rules is not present, then strategy implementation is sure to fail. Okay, so that's for ground rules, okay, or norms. Another consideration in technology management is commitment. And this is something that has been alluded to, at least tangentially, in the previous considerations, such as culture, such as alignment, or even planning or communication. But here, commitment is its own distinct consideration, right? And it has to be called out as such that if you notice that the organization isn't fully committed to the technology, then no matter how great the technology is, no matter how promising it would be, without the commitment of the organization or the community, for example, or of the market, the commitment of the market to go into a new technological ecosystem, for example, then the strategy will fall flat. Okay. And sometimes commitment is not just simply a rational type of commitment. Okay. Most of the time, it's also emotional. Okay. Maybe they're attached to the old way of doing things. Maybe there's some sentimental value there, perhaps. You can look at it that way. Or they could be pressured by other things that's not really related to the technology at hand. Could be other things. Could be they're pressured because they have some other goals to fulfill or some other goals to reach. Okay, but that has nothing to do with technology. In the same way, but nevertheless, they're still important when you're considering the appropriate strategy for your technology. You have to assess whether it is possible for you to actually get commitment from these people. Okay. Early on, and you get it early on. You don't get it towards the end, right? It becomes very, very expensive. You try to do something already at the start, but haven't gotten the commitment yet. Okay. And then all of a sudden, as you're about to roll it out, and you realize you haven't gotten the commitment of the people yet, and you try to work on it, I mean, you probably spend more time having to perhaps do rework. Okay, if you really can't budge them to follow through with what you have. Or it can, worst case, you're probably going to waste a lot of money for something that's not going to be implemented anymore. Okay, so it's good that you try to get the commitment at the start. Okay, and sometimes it starts with socializing the idea even. And it helps if you have things like prototypes or proof of concepts. That helps in building the commitment, right? If you have pilots, and this is why another important theme that we've discussed already would be the aspect of experimentation, the idea of trying things out, learning, okay, from the experiments, and adjusting and doing the next iteration. Okay. Now, only if everyone involved in the implementation of the strategy assumes responsibility for its execution will the vision turn into action. Okay. Another consideration is resources. Well, this seems to be commonsensical, but I think it's good that it's called out. Resources. Okay, the greatest strategy cannot be implemented if the people tasked with implementing it do not have the appropriate resources. So you need money, you need capital, you need equipment, you need the right tools, the right know-how, even. Okay, that's part of resources. I mean, and I think it goes without saying that even if you like the technology, it seems so fantastic, but you don't have the appropriate resources, the appropriate funding for that. Okay, then okay, yeah, you will fall flat. Okay, you will not be able to be successful here. Okay, senior management must thus provide sufficient resources such as financing, manpower, technical expertise, time. Okay, time, if viewed as a resource, is also important, and information. Without these, the developed strategy will not lead to the intended outcome or will not be implemented at all. Okay. Knowledge on the viability of resources is thus a vital part of the strategy development stage. Um, Yeah, and sometimes, um, there's this saying. I don't know if this is a true saying in Japanese, right? But that's something that I've heard that it doesn't matter if the swordsman has one sword or two swords, right? Uh, some people might think that having two swords would be better than having just one sword. But really, it's not just about the number of swords, it's about the swordsman. So, in that sense, but nevertheless, I mean, it's not just about the numerous options for resources. So that would really count the most. Sometimes that's not always the important thing, right? It's how you make use of the available resources. That's really more important, right? But naturally, okay, before we go into the effective use of resources, okay, the most fundamental aspect here is that you need to have resources. Okay, a swordsman who does not have a sword is inutile. Right? You're not going to get much from that swordsman if that swordsman doesn't even have a sword to begin with. But once you give that swordsman a sword, okay, or two swords, or three swords, or whatever, okay, then the swordsman would make some adjustments. Okay, okay. But definitely, the point here is that if you don't give the swordsman any sword, then don't expect that the swordsman will be successful. Same thing here. Okay? If you're not going to give the team, the organization, the resources that it would need to actually draw much value from the technology that's being implemented, then forget it. Don't expect that it will be successful at all. Okay. Okay, and then we look at framework. Okay, so are you uh, going to implement a certain technology according to a framework or scaffolding in mind? Okay, so frameworks or management approaches, such as the balanced scorecard, for example, can assist managers in implementing key performance indicators to determine the state of strategy implementation. So, and right now, in a lot of technology organizations, they are replete with a lot of technology, right? A lot of frameworks. So I don't think you would lack in this area. Um, it's a question of what framework is appropriate. For example, common development practices back in the old days, we've been used to a very structured and rigid methodology, such as the waterfall. Okay, that's one framework of software development. Another framework in software development would be agile. Okay? And even in agile, you have very specific things. Okay? So those are possible frameworks. So the question right now that you have is, what framework should I be using for my current situation, for my current context? Okay? If I'm developing new technology, do I use agile or do I use waterfall or do I use something else? Right? So these are considerations. Okay. And sometimes the framework helps or assists in the visualization of the strategy, which sort of lends itself to the communication theme that we just talked a while ago. Okay? So that's something that you can consider. Okay? Next would be structure. Okay, so there are contrasting views on whether or not to restructure an organization in order to implement strategy. So this refers to the organizational structure. Okay, will your current structure be adequate for the technology that you have, or do you need to move people around, or do you need to create new teams? Okay, or even in more complex setups, do you need to acquire a smaller company to make your technology work? Okay. Um, and notice that the aspect of structure becomes very, very important when you're thinking about acquiring the appropriate technology for yourselves, right? As in the case, let's say, of the technology acquisition theme that we've discussed some time ago. Okay. Generally, it can be argued that restructuring an org can make it leaner, fitter, and simpler, will have a positive effect on the implementation of strategy. Well, That's true for some cases, but sometimes it's a balance, right? You have to know what you can change in your organizational structure, and that would also inform on the appropriate strategy that you can take on, right? Uh, and this is normally true, and I'm sure you guys are aware of this, that when it comes to changes, especially in IT, it's not always a system change. It's not just limited to a system change. You also need to have a process change, right? So if you're going to implement a new thing, let's say a new system, new IT system, it's not just a mere implementation of the system, right? You know that people will have to make adjustments around that system. So there's going to be a process change as well. But on top of the process change, it's possible that there could be a structure change in order to support that particular implementation. So, okay, so that's something that you have to be conscious about. Okay, and we don't just simply change the structure because there's a change that's happening, right? Um, Sometimes changing the structure might do more harm than good. We know that also by experience and even by intuition. And changing an organizational structure can be very, very costly. So the decision to change the structure is a very difficult decision to make, right? It can take you years before you can be given the green light. And by then, the parameters of the environment have changed considerably to the point that your earlier proposal will no longer be valid years from then. Okay? Your organization, unfortunately, was slow in that regard. So you can see the tension when it comes to structure. Structure is not to be taken lightly, okay? Or the question about changing structure shouldn't be taken lightly. But nevertheless, I mean, these are things that we will look into. Okay, so that's pretty much it on the ideas concerning technology selection or technology strategy. Um, are there any questions with the topic at hand? Do you guys have anything to bring up or share, or maybe have some burning comments or opinions about the topic? Okay, if there's none, I will stop recording.